Hi, I'm Josh Zaring, Zaring Studios. Today we're going to go over the shots that we made in the last tutorial in the snow. Now we're going to be in Lightroom, and I'm going to show you the edits, as well as I have a 2-photo HDR image that I'm just going to use photo merge in Lightroom for, and I have a Panorama, 3 or 4 photos to put together. But I started with no import preset. This is just straight from the raw files. I just want to show you from scratch what I'm doing. So here we go. This is my shot of the gray card, and I like the color of this. I'm just going to see what the white balance tool does to it. And it makes it yellow. I don't like that. I'm just gonna try a couple other spots here. But this is how you would use this most of the time. And that's pretty close there. But I'm just gonna stick with the original as shot, because all these photos will be this, because I did not use auto white balance. I set my white balance using this and set my exposure using this. More often than not, I'd be more likely to trust my own white balance than what the camera or Lightroom says. Although a lot of the time, if I'm having trouble, the auto white balance sometimes in Lightroom does a pretty good job. And that's over here. For new users, this is the eyedropper tool for the white balance. You just click that and bring it where you see the most neutral, that being gray, or maybe a light, like I have a black sleeve here. I could actually get it off of that. Right here are your white balance options. As shot, auto, daylight, cloudy, shade, tungsten, fluorescent, flash, and custom. Now, moving on here, I haven't done anything to these photos yet, so I'm gonna go to the first one. And this is the first one that I shot in the first tutorial when I was actually shooting. And you can see over here, you can see all the way back into the woods here. You can see the shading, the dark spots in the snow. They're there. They're all still there. And that's what you want. This may be slightly underexposed, but you noticed all the detail in the shadows and the highlights. If I would have blown them out to something like that, what the camera may have told me from the metering, I would never be able to recover this and make it look like this. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to first combine these two. I have a slightly darker one, and this is actually more of just combining for detail, but it will look better than one shot. So I'm going to right click after selecting both photos and photo merge, and I'm going to hit HDR for this one. It's going to create a preview. So, okay, now that that's done, I can deghost it, or I can choose to like it the way it is. I'm going to try medium deghosting. Like, I did use a tripod, but I noticed watching the video back that I moved the tripod and took this second shot. So they weren't lined up, but it wasn't as if I stood a different distance away or tilted the camera too far or anything. So Lightroom automatically lined that up perfectly. I should not actually have to use deghosting at all. But what that does is it takes the things that aren't alike and kind of blends them away. You can adjust so it doesn't look bad. Like if this tree here or a branch or something like that weren't in line, like say it was windy, it would allow you to more or less kind of choose which photo, the top or bottom or middle, however many shots you took, and let you select that. I'm just gonna hit merge here. So here's the combined photo, and you can see it actually lightened up there. What I'm gonna do now is I'm just gonna go right down through the exposure. I'm gonna start with contrast. I usually bump it up just a little bit, and this time I might bump it up even more. That's pretty good. I like to crank things sometimes and then see how dumb it kind of looks, and then back off of that. And then now I'm gonna get down to highlights, which I see it automatically did a few things here. Here's your highlights. Now I'm gonna back off the contrast a little more again. And the shadows. I really mess with the shadows a lot. You can take them all the way out, which will really brighten it without overdoing the highlights too much. I like pulling the highlights down. That's just my thing. I don't know how many people do this, but when I pull the highlights down, even if they're not out of control, it just lets me see. I feel like it adds more clarity. and I'm just gonna leave the shadows at +9, and the whites just go by sight, by feel here, -24, and the blacks I'll probably go back up and adjust the contrast after this. We have, okay, I can back off the contrast a bit. And what I like to do here is I usually don't touch too much saturation, but I will boost the vibrance. And I'll go all the way up just to see what it looks like up there, and then back off. We're not dealing with a whole lot of color here, mainly browns and greens. So you could get away with putting it the whole way up just to make the greens back here pop, but then that takes the attention off of the main thing, which here I pretty much, I think that's the creek itself and the stones with the snow overhang. So I'm going to go down to clarity. This is probably my favorite part. I'm going to blast that the whole way up and hide it by accident. I'm going to blast that the whole way up, and then I like to do this a couple times until I like it. Sometimes it's too much. I'm going to leave it probably 50. I'm just going to type in 50 here. And then I bump the exposure just a little bit. I'm going to go down here to calibration. It's on Adobe Standard because I left everything. I imported just raw, no import preset or anything. And I'm going to try neutral and then standard. Standard looks better, I think. Yeah. And you don't even have to use these. A lot of people do, though. It's basically it's what your camera gives you, and then Adobe kind of approximates it as close as possible for each camera. So okay, I'm happy with that. That's pretty good. I'm going to move on to, there's a couple shots here. I'm going to move on to the panorama and then come back to this portrait here. You can see this was all handheld. Sometimes this works, sometimes it doesn't. And I'm going to take these three and combine them. You can see Lightroom's going to see the same things in each photo. You have to have, usually have to have it pretty lined up. Lightroom's going to see those things and overlap them and hopefully spit out a panorama that looks decent, and then you can take it from there in your editing. But I usually don't edit until after things are put together because even if you copy the settings, sometimes from one picture to the next, it'll be different. Now, I know I use the same camera settings for all three pictures, so it's pretty much locked in. So I'm going to right-click on that, hit Photo Merge, and hit Panorama. And the barn's actually lined up as far as I can see in this little almost thumbnail. The barn is straight up and down, and I actually have the second picture isn't really, it's kind of not straight. So Lightroom automatically fixed that. I normally combine images like this in Photoshop, actually 90% of the time, but it's the same company and it pretty much does the same thing. I do like Photoshop for certain things. There's a certain degree more of control and layers and everything like that. Painting in shadows and highlights and color and stuff like that, I really like doing that in Photoshop with the Wacom tablet. That's a big deal compared to Lightroom. But here it is, and that looks not too bad. It looks pretty flat. So what I'm going to do here is go ahead and take my new defaults for this photo shoot, basically, if you want to call it a photo shoot, landscape photo shoot. I'm just going to hit sync and leave the crop alone, even though I didn't crop it. I don't want it to take on the same aspect ratio because it's a wide image. And I'm going to leave lens corrections alone, and that's pretty much it there. Since this was a lighter picture, it really blasted it out, but I have my basics. I'm just going to knock the exposure down a tad, bump it up a little, and now I'm going to show you a small trick to bring back in. It was a pretty overcast day, but you can still bring out some of the clouds and maybe a little bit of blue. We'll see here in a second. You select your graduated filter or just hit M, and then you go here and you just drag down. These aren't the settings I'm going to be using. You just drag down, not too far, especially since we have the trees and the barn here. I end with exposure on this step. I like to pull the shadows. I noticed the shadows do really cool things to the skies, even though it's not technically supposed to be like that. and then I'll pull the highlights down, and that really isn't doing a whole lot. Like I said, it was pretty overcast. And then the clarity will also help bring out clouds, and then finally the saturation. And I'm really not seeing a whole lot of difference here. You can only get so much out, and you can go in and Photoshop clouds in and everything, but I like to just, for this in particular, that's what it looked like. And I'm not really going to mess with that too much. I will drop the exposure just to see what happens. You can see up top there, you can see them start to come out, but I have it way too dark. Exposure's like all the way down. And that's a job for Photoshop, where I could put it in Photoshop in a separate layer and kind of erase this and then drop the opacity just enough to where you're not going to notice how fake it might look. You won't notice it as much. This actually looks pretty cool. I just don't like how it sticks out like a sore thumb over here and at the tip of this tree. The barn had actually added a nice shadow there. It's important to include a person in this. And you'll notice, again, this is just a flat image. This is completely raw image. You'll notice that his skin tone is, if you could see him, you would know the skin tone is dead on. It's dead on. And I mean, that's what my son looks like. And that's the color that his skin is. And that's all because of this guy right here. You set your white balance. It's going to change. I did check it, but you can see here from shot to shot, we have consistent skin tone. And that's really what you want as a starting point. You can do whatever you want after that, but when you start with good white balance and good exposure, you have a lot more to work with once you get into Lightroom or whatever program you use. I'm going to bump the clarity up just a little bit. When you do it too much with people, they kind of stop looking like themselves. So you just add a little bit just for the cut, just for the edge of the image. And I'm going to pull the blacks down. See how his coat just automatically looked better? Everything just automatically looks better. Sometimes you can start at the blacks. If a picture looks particularly washed out, start at the blacks, leave the contrast alone until you mess with the blacks. If it looks like you might not be able to use the image, start with the blacks. Now, the highlights, that's different with people versus landscapes. When I pull that down, his face turns sort of a very light reddish orange, and that's not what color he is. If he had hit a tanning booth before this, yeah, that would probably represent him pretty well. So I'm only going to pull that down a little bit. If I push it up, he gets washed out. If I pull it down a little bit, it evens it out and gives it a little more dimension. Now the shadows, this could go either way. This is a matter of taste here. So you pull it up and you lose the blacks that I just put in, but it clears some things up. However, on a portrait, I don't like it. So I'm just going to leave shadows at 0, and I like the way that looks. So we'll see what contrast does to this. There it looks more like a raw image. Here it looks like I went too far, and probably around 15 is a good choice here. I'm just going to punch that in. And then I'm going to bump. I don't like to bump the exposure, but this is like a last step here. I'm just bumping it 0.23, and that's pretty much all I'm going to do that. And you can see there's not a whole lot done here. What I did was I basically developed the image from a raw file and came up with that. So if you have any questions about this, I realize I only covered 3 images here, but a lot of these, like I'll be able to take this first one here and apply it to these 4, and probably minimal adjustments after that because of the white balance. That's why it's so important to start out with good white balance and good exposure. It might not look right, but once you get it into the computer, like if you would have seen this raw image hanging on my wall, you would have said, Josh, that's too dark. But starting with this flat raw image that's slightly underexposed lets you have, in the end, more options, more color. You can see it just brought the color out. When it's predominantly, it's white. There's a lot of white in there, but what it did was it gave the image more dimension. And that's what you want to start out with. When you start out with something that looks flat like this, that actually looks pretty good right from the get-go. From then on, all you're doing is improving. You're just fine-tuning it. You're not recovering a mistake. And a mistake would be not getting the white balance right, relying on the camera to give you the right exposure, especially like in evaluative mode on Canon or matrix mode on Nikon, you don't know what you're going to get, and you can't really trust it. That's why I use spot metering and I use a gray card, where I focus on something that's neutral and then what I actually want to shoot. So I hope this helped you in your shooting and your editing. Keep creating and keep it awesome.